Hi guys, and welcome to episode 9 of Behind the Frame. I hope you've been enjoying this series. The feedback and the comments that we've been getting has been great, and I've actually been surprised at how many people are commenting directly on YouTube. So do me a favor, and when you do watch this, won't you leave a comment wherever you have found this, whether it's on the Wild Eye blog, directly on YouTube, or even on Instagram, if that's where the source is. Just leave me a comment, and I'd also like to know where in the world you are watching from. So how many people are actually photographing African wildlife on a day-to-day basis versus coming out on safari and getting their Africa fix. This week's topic, I'm going to be looking at cropping. It was something that was requested a couple of weeks ago, and it's actually a great idea. So I've gathered a little collection of images together. These have been edited in order to save time, and I'm not going to go through the editing on each of them, but next week we'll revert to editing a single image, and we'll have a look a little bit more at the technical specs of those images. This week we're going to be addressing cropping. It's a powerful tool and something that a lot of people struggle with in terms of how much can they crop, how much should they crop, what dimensions to use when they crop. So let's kick things off. We'll have a look at this image of a young male lion. This was taken in Duba Plains in Botswana a couple of years ago, and just an incredible scene for any wildlife photographer. You know, this wall of horns with a beautiful male lion in front, and these guys were actually taunting the buffalo, trying to get the herd to come back into their area. Just an incredible scene to watch. So it's been processed. It was overcast, and I liked the kind of mood and feel processing this as a black and white image. You can see ISO 2,500 to get 1/800th of a second. So yeah. Right, when I'm deciding on how to crop an image, the first thing, and this is something that you should do even in the field, is that you would always try and get your final, or as close to your final composition in the field. Now, if you're shooting with a prime lens, so fixed focal length, that can be a little bit more challenging compared to if you have a telephoto lens, something like a 200 to 400 or an 80 to 400, where you can zoom in or pull back a little bit more to get that perfect composition. This was taken with a 300mm prime, a fantastic lens, so I didn't really have too much room to play. Composition here, the story of having this male lion in the foreground, sharp and in focus, with these wall of horns in the background. It's a very powerful story, and one which we can further enhance through cropping. So the shortcut for cropping in Lightroom is simply the R key, and something that you may or may not know is you've got a series of different overlays and that you can cycle through. So these will all refer to different kind of guidelines and cropping ratios. I like to use the rule of thirds. As you can see here, we've got our 4 power points, and that kind of shows where these lines intersect is where the eye will naturally be drawn to. So in terms of the crop, I'm looking around, and the first thing that I'll do is try and enhance the story that I'm trying to tell, and secondly, deal with any potentially distracting elements. Now, for us, when we look at an image, we're drawn to the sharpest part of the image, and that's perfect. The focus point was on the line, thank heavens. And then we go to the brightest points or areas with greatest contrast. And so obviously the dark buffalo in the background with this bright line in the foreground. But if you have a look carefully, you should see that there are a couple of white highlights, and these are egrets that are in the background. So have a look in this top left-hand corner, over here in the center, and through here. Those are potentially distracting elements. Yes, it's a small thing, but these are the sort of things that you need to look at. Can we go in there and use a spot removal tool? Sure. Would I prefer to remove them with a crop? Most definitely. So just by moving the cropping frame in a little bit, I'm able to deal with those points as we've seen. Now, before I select and finalize my crop, I'm looking around to see if there are any other potentially distracting elements that I may want to deal with before finalizing my crop. So if we have a look here, that little horn, half horn of the buffalo on the right-hand side of the frame, I'm comfortable that we can take that out completely without changing the story too much. And if we have a look and we go through our information, it actually shows you how many pixels you have left. So in terms of worrying about print size, and this was something that someone came to me with, you know, this kind of a crop, you're not going to have any problem cropping to this size and then printing. There are guidelines available on the website. I don't do much printing, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. But what I'm saying is that we've still got, what's 4,800 times 3,200. You've got well over 12 megapixels there if we crop to this point. And now there's the finished image. And you'll find that those little highlights of the egrets up on the top left-hand side there have now disappeared. The image is a lot stronger. If you have a look on the edge of the frame, there's no real head of a buffalo that is now being cut in half or anything, so we've addressed that. A very simple and easy crop. Let's have a look at the next example. A beautiful scene somewhere in Africa. Those of you who've been to the Mara will know exactly where this is. Please don't hammer me for giving away locations. But the Olulolu escarpment in the background there, beautiful background to this image. Now, again, first thing when you decide on where and how to crop an image is you've got to think about what is the story that you're wanting to tell. And in this instance, the story is as much about the sense of space and scale that these animals find themselves in as it is about the animal itself. So again, hitting R to go into our crop and having a look here, potentially distracting elements. Well, points of contrast on the edge of frame. So this dark green bush on the edge of the frame, in amongst this yellow grass, these little plants down at the bottom here, that to me is potentially distracting. So let's deal with the ones on the left-hand side of the frame. There we go, those ones are out. Now we've got these ones here in the foreground. So again, we're just going to lift up. And yes, we're losing quite a bit of the frame, but not necessarily a bad thing. So we're going to go now, I want to use an aspect ratio of 16:9. Now, anyone who's got an HD TV and you want to see your images full screen on the TV, crop every single one of them to 16:9 because that is the resolution and the dimensions of that TV. So when it comes to cropping resolutions, dimensions, you'll see that Lightroom gives you a number of presets. 16:9 is a fantastic one for a lot of screens, and for me what it does is it emphasizes the width of a scene. So now that we've done that, I can actually grow the space a little bit more. You'll see that I'm taking it right to the edge of this green bush here, which was part of the original distracting element that I wanted to deal with through this. And so I'm going to come down as low as possible. And so you'll see that the rule of thirds, we've got this line that runs along the bottom here. Now that says that theoretically your subject should be there. But by doing that, we're starting to include some of these bushes here in the foreground. So I would rather go somewhere like that. And because the story with this image is one of trying to emphasize space, I'm happy with this 2/3 of negative space up in the top of the frame here. Just looking at the histogram, I can afford to pull down the blacks a little bit more. And so there we have our final image. So going back to the original, we can just hit reset on our cropping function. You can see how a fairly busy scene has been cut down to a very clean, simple scene which emphasizes the story, the original story that I wanted to portray, and that is one of a sense of space. 16:9 is a beautiful kind of dimension for emphasizing the width of a scene without having to shoot an actual panorama. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to the dimensions of a frame. So here's another aerial scene from the Okavango Delta. I'll be back there in June and I cannot wait to share this experience with guests. Obviously, when you're photographing from a helicopter with a wide-angle lens, you don't really have too much time to zoom in and get your perfect composition when you're flying across these kind of scenes which may capture your eye. So it really is a case of shooting a little bit wider than what you would normally and then cropping to the final story afterwards. So obviously the main feature here is this little palm island with these pathways radiating outwards from it. And now this is all natural, untouched land. All of these paths that you see here will more than likely be from hippos and elephants moving across to these islands to feed and then moving through onto the next island. So if we open up again, the shortcut for this is R. We open up our cropping section here, crop tool, and I want to straighten this angle a little bit, so it feels a little bit off. So I want to crop to straighten the angle to something along those lines, and that feels correct for me. And so you'll see that the crop adjustment has taken place, and it's now the whole image has shifted around that. So now, again, coming back to the point that I made about looking for potentially distracting elements. First thing is this patch of bright water, which is reflecting sky in the top right-hand side of frame. I want to try and deal with that. So I'm going to crop as much of that out as possible. So let's say we end up somewhere around there. Whatever little bit of brightness is left there, we can deal with that using a localized adjustment, a special adjustment brush, which you guys are familiar with now. Now looking at that, however, we've included this patch of grasses. And for me, the more uniform the environment around this island is, the better and the more powerful the image is. So I feel excuse me, that these reeds up on the top here are actually distracting from an otherwise uniform environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crop in again, and that's where we kind of get ourselves to. And now, looking at the patterning of these pathways that are radiating outwards from these islands, I'm going to shift this over just a little bit and maybe bring this angle back, because I would like to try and get that path leading out into the top of the frame there. I'm going to bring that in just a little bit. And so something like that as a final image becomes far more interesting than what we originally started off with. And so the process here, guys, is really about looking at the image and deciding, do I need to crop this? Is there something that I can do to emphasize the story that I'm trying to tell? And then once you start to play around with where you're going to crop this image to, is before you fix that crop into place, is to explore the edges of the frame. See if there's anything else that is either cutting straight through the frame. In particular, points of high contrast, so a black branch or a white highlight or something along those lines. By cutting those out, you're giving your viewer a far more concentrated story in which their eyes can explore the scene. So here, brightest point of the image is the Palm Island. That's exactly what we want. Would have been great to have an elephant against that white sand, point of contrast, subject in the frame. And then you've got these radiating pathways which go outwards. So you go straight into the island and then are free to explore the rest of the scene without having any of these distracting images, distracting elements. So I'm just going to go back. I'm going to reset, and let's just say we include all of these things in here, and we take something like that. You'll see that your eye goes here, then it's up there, then it's at the bright water. So the whole idea here is really just to enhance the story that you're trying to tell, give your viewer no other option but to look at the places that you want them to. Let's have a look at another example here. So the sepia tone that you'll see on this, Marlon is going to be hosting the Behind the Frame series in 2 weeks' time, where he's going to look at how he applies a sepia split tone to some of his images. This is obviously in Kenya with the Great Migration. The slow shutter speed, 1/10 of a second. We've done an episode on panning already. But now it's a point of having a look at the actual image and saying, right, how are we going to crop this to become something more interesting? Potentially distracting elements. Obviously the wildebeest up in the top right hand side of the frame, and these wildebeest backsides on this side. So let's see if we were to keep this as a portrait orientation, what we could do. So why I'm moving this around is that if we just over here, these animals, because they're moving from left to right, we want to give them space to move into, and so we want to move that over somewhere around here. So we've got those wildebeest butts on the backside. We've got that wildebeest leg still in the top right-hand side of the frame, but that's blurred enough that it doesn't actually become a point of contrast. So you'll see the contrast is on the bright beard or on the black bridge of the nose. So by cutting all of that out, we could look at something along these lines. So that could potentially work as a portrait crop. You've got a bit of the Mara River and these white, very white highlights down at the bottom here as the streaking across the river itself renders on the camera. But let's go back into our grid view. What I'm going to do, we can leave that one, and we're going to create a virtual copy of this image. And here we go. Let's move this one up there. Right, and on this one, I want to open up the crop tool again. The shortcut to change the orientation of your crop is X. Make sure that you don't do it when you've got the image selected, because that will disappear. And so we crop that in, take away the backside there. Just in terms of balancing space from left and right hand side of the frame. Because these animals are moving to the right again, I want to bring this in from the left and try and keep equal distance on either side. And so this is what I would refer to as a rather extreme crop. And if we have a look at the information on here, 3.3 by 2.2, so you're looking at about 6.5 megapixels. This would still be good enough to do a fairly small print. You're obviously not you wouldn't want to blow it up, but if you look at the actual image and you think about how much you're actually cropping out to get this, rest assured that something like this will work on pretty much any social media platform that you can find. So if we then have a look at the two images that we've now selected, and I'm just going to bring them back up using N to go through like a survey view, you can see two very different stories here, and my preference is for the one on the right. looking at it now, this dark strip where the river bank meets the actual river itself, obviously being wet, moist earth, being a lot darker than the rest of the bank, that to me is a potentially distracting element which pulls my eye away from the wildebeest. So I'm kind of doing this if I look at the scene, whereas here it purely becomes about the animal itself and not so much about the bank. So that's the kind of crop that I would go for on that image. Let's go back to our grid and have a look at our next subject here. So, sandgrouse photographed in Madikwe. And again, as you take the shot, have a look, perfect composition, 600 mils, didn't really have too much to play around with. I wanted to include a lot of foreground here, using that beautiful shallow depth of field that the 600 f4 lens allows us to. Problem here, distracting elements, yes, these two in the top right-hand side of frame. In this instance, a simple crop, just pulling it in and looking at the rule of thirds in my PowerPoint. I'm just going to lift up slightly. I've now dealt with those two on the right-hand side of the frame. There's my finished image. Simple. It doesn't always have to be a massive crop, especially if you've shot intentionally in camera. So that's something to keep in mind. Let's have a look at another example here. So this is a portrait of a fairly well-known lion. This is Scar from the Masai Mara. And again, shot with a 400mm lens, so not too much room to play in terms of composition. Just clipping some of the hairs coming off of the right-hand side of his mane over here. Beautiful portrait, potentially distracting elements. There should be two things that really jump out at you. The first is this little patch of grass which is stuck in the mane. So because it's against the black part of the mane, you've got orange grass against black mane, and that means that you have a point of contrast. So whilst I look at this image, I go to his eye and to the muzzle, and then I go across to this bright part over here. The other thing with portraits is you want to keep them nice and tight and intimate, and you really don't want your viewer to wander. And so this patch of light in the bottom left-hand corner here, which is his leg, that draws my eye away from his face as well. So I'm going to open up the crop tool, and I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to try to keep these dimensions because I want to keep the largest possible image initially and edit that, and then start to take things further down the line. Right, so I've now addressed that little piece of grass on the mane. You'll see that I'm purist because I can very easily have gone and just taken that out with a spot removal. Anyway, that's a discussion for another time. Now that I've cropped that out, I'm still left with this little bit on the bottom left here, which again still pulls my eye away from my subject. So we want to have nice uniform dark edges to this frame. If we start to look at something like that, we're now starting to get a little bit more interesting. Now the challenge is we've got this little bit of grass that comes down at the bottom of the frame over here. So I'm going to try and lift up, try and exclude as much of that as possible. And I think that's probably where we're going to end this. So you'll see now when you look at this, even though we've still got this tiny piece of grass up at the top there, at the bottom here, it's not having as big an impact on the image as it initially was. And by cutting that blade of grass that was stuck to his mane out of the frame completely, we've got a far more intense portrait. So when you look at this, you should go straight to the eyes and to the face, being the brightest part of the image. At this scale, where we've cropped it now, there are 3 little flies across the top here. And so for example purposes, I'm going to open up the spot removal brush and very, very quickly go and address those 3 little flies for you. And they are now gone. And that's about as good a portrait of Scar as one could ever wish for. Beautiful male lion. I do hope that guests and the rest of our team will be able to catch up with him in the Mara, which is just a couple of months away from now. Finally, taking an image of a leopard tortoise. So again, this was shot at 400mm f16 because we were very close, literally off the side of the vehicle, to try and get detail here. So I didn't want to shoot this at f2.8 where just a tiny part of the shell would be sharp and in focus. I wanted a lot more depth. Potentially distracting elements here. Well, obviously this little top left-hand corner on that side. So again, opening up the crop tool. 2 ways to do this. Why don't we look at emphasizing the width of the scene again. So we're going to a 16:9, and then we just bring in that left-hand side altogether. Now, the reason I chose this one is because it's very interesting. We've got a whole bunch of shapes and textures and lines going across here. And you'll see that we've cut a very bright area through on the top right-hand side of this frame over here, as well as a line over there. So my inclination is to go and look at how can we include this bottom line over here. And by doing that, we have now removed that bright kind of section of the carapace that we cut through at the top of the frame there. So that, for me, as a final crop, works very well. A couple of side notes on cropping. First thing is that I generally start to crop before I edit. And the reason for that is that by cropping out, let's say you've got an image with bright sky and the foreground. If you crop that to 16:9 to emphasize the width of the story, your histogram is automatically going to change because you're now cutting out some of that bright area and the bright parts of the sky. I also like to crop as little as possible initially, because that then allows me to come back in and use that same image for multiple purposes down the line. So for example, rather than going in and doing a very, very tight crop, only to then have someone ask for me to use that image in something where they need a much larger image or a slightly different dimension, I then have to go and re-edit the whole thing. So I'll rather re-edit on a large scale and then be able to crop out portions of that image down the line. And then the final kind of little takeaway message here is that when you crop, your post-crop vignette that you're going to apply will obviously only apply to that crop. So if you change your crop, you may need to change the vignetting sliders that you've already applied. And you'll see that when you open up the crop tool, the vignette goes away completely and is only then reapplied once you've cropped. So that's it for episode 9 of Behind the Frame. I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I hope that this will help you to crop your images into far stronger storytelling images. As always, if you have any questions, drop me an email, get in touch, more than happy to help. Cheers.